Greetings, I am Rumbizai Kandawashikanundu, the Principal Advisor at International IDEA. In this video, I would like to discuss about building resilience to prevent gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes in order to be able to protect the integrity of the elections. The purpose of this discussion is first and foremost to create and build an understanding on the issue around gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes. And one of the things that we need to underline and place emphasis is on what is it that causes gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes. And in this regard, it is important to point out that gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes is underpinned by complex and multiple systemic and structural intersecting factors. And these factors are both formal and informal in terms of we see them in the laws that are legislated in countries within the context which shape the context in which electoral processes occur. They are also shaped and informed by social cultural norms and practices and gender stereotypes. So it is very important in this video to also be sure that we lay the framework as to why gender-based discrimination intersects with violence against women political actors. That is in their various roles. It could be as voters, it could be as party members or aspirants, or candidates, or even party officials, and in some instances as elections observers or electoral media reporters and elected leaders and electoral officials. The issue that is driving gender-based violence and discrimination in electoral processes is because of the way women and men in all their diversity are treated and regarded differently in almost all societies. And we need the next part also to talk about the different forms of gender-based violence in electoral processes, because this can include both physical and non-physical forms of violence. For instance, it can be psychological, it can be emotional, it can be sexual harassment, it can be intimidation, and even abuse and destruction of property that impedes the full participation and representation of women and as men in every sphere of electoral processes or elections. Although gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination can be experienced by anyone because of their gender, across the world it is well recorded and documented that women and girls in all their diversity tend to be in the majority of those who are affected. Therefore, we need to realize the extent to which the occurrence of gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes undermines the integrity of elections, for instance, and the outcome of elections. And this is very fundamental in terms of making sure that we build resilience with all the different forms of backsliding and the different forms of regression in terms of democracy development, democracy building, and the attacks on electoral processes. It is therefore important to be able to have different stakeholders and actors put in place mechanisms and measures that can mitigate and prevent gender-based discrimination and violence. And in this regard, one of the examples I would like to cite in order to draw some lessons which are very important in terms of the good practices and mechanisms on resilience building to prevent gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes is the example of the case of Bolivia, which is the first country in the world to pass a national law which specifically criminalizes political violence and harassment against women in all their diversity. So what it boils down to and what is required ultimately is first and foremost to acknowledge that our electoral processes across the world, they are affected by gender-based discrimination and violence. And then it becomes fundamental for electoral management bodies, which we normally just shorten and call EMBs, political parties, civil society organizations, candidates, even political aspirants, those who are contesting for elections or for elective positions of power and decision-making, and they are party members and party supporters, to take cognizance of the fact that whatever is done in any particular electoral phase has a profound impact on the outcome and integrity of an election. And in this regard, in terms of this video, we are emphasizing the need for having a gender-sensitive and gender-responsive lens in order to build resilience and prevent gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes, if at all we are going to be able to see the integrity, the real integrity of electoral processes or outcome of elections. In this video, again, we would like to see emphasize the need for national mapping, which will help stakeholders, national actors, to identify the potential points for strategic actions in order to build resilience and prevent gender-based discrimination and violence. Because this mapping in the different electoral phases will be knowledge-based and informs the measures and mechanisms that can be effectively implemented. And at the same time, the mapping should also help in identifying and adopting the resilience building measures that are institutionalized, because without these institutionalized measures on resilience building and addressing gender-based discrimination and violence and its outcome in electoral processes, we will continue to see the unequal or unleveled playing field or environment in which elections occur from a gender equality and women's empowerment perspective. Therefore, I would like to conclude with also highlighting a key definition in terms of what is informing our discussion on building a resilience to prevent gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes in order to protect the integrity of elections. This has to be a key factor in our understanding of the interventions. The clear definition of gender discrimination, which is defined as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment or exercise by women and girls in all their diversity, irrespective of their marital status, on the basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this is what is provided for in the United Nations 1978 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women under Article 1 of the CEDAW Convention. And on the basis of that, it's important to underline that this definition gives us the parameters to recognize and address discrimination, whether it is contained in laws, whether it is contained in policies, whether it's in procedures or practices or behaviors in societies, which ultimately impact and affect how people participate and are represented in electoral processes in different parts across the world. Thank you for your attention, and we hope that we will continue to share more lessons on building resilience to prevent gender-based discrimination and violence in electoral processes, building upon one of the good practices that I have pointed out of a country that has made progress in terms of even having an institutionalized legislative framework that then informs the processes, the practices, the procedures, and the expected behaviors of all the different actors in the electoral cycle. Thank you.